The Stormspeeder Hammer Strike is a modification of the heavily armed and armored Stormspeeder. Specifically designed to hunt monsters and vehicles at close range, it is most used as a vanguard vehicle to weaken enemies for the rest of the Astartes army. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and welcome to another video where today we are covering the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, a flying skimmer-type vehicle used by the Space Marines of course, Warhammer 40k. So the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike comes in at 125 points. It has the standard Stormspeeder stat line. It moves at a blazing fast, 14 inches. It's toughness 9 with a 3+ save, 11 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 3, so fairly standard for the cost, though nothing special. In terms of ranged weapons, the Hammer Strike missile launcher is 36-inch range, with 2 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 3, and damage D6, so a slightly upgunned missile launcher, which is solid enough against light vehicles. The Crack Storm Grenade Launcher is 1 attack. It has 2 of these that hit on 3s at 18-inch range with strength 9, AP 1, and damage D3, so a slightly downgraded Crack Grenade Launcher. And the Melta Destroyer is Melter 2, 18-inch range at 3 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 4, and damage D6. Of course, Melta is quite good, though it can be quite difficult to wound tough things. Its melee is just Armored Hull, which is 4 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. In terms of abilities, it has Deadly Demise D3, so a little bit of an explosion to be worried about if there's anything fragile nearby. And it has Deep Strike if you want to keep it in reserves to drop somewhere, though it is rather large, so doing that may be difficult just given its immense footprint. Its special rule is Hammer Strike. Each time this model has shot, select one enemy unit hit by one or more of the attacks. That unit cannot have the benefit of cover for the rest of the phase. This is a fairly interesting ability, though I would say is generally outclassed by its little brother, the Hail Strike, as +1 AP gives it effectively the same ability. However, this is still useful, especially for units that like to hide way back and use cover to keep themselves safe while plinking off shots with high power weaponry. Though again, I would still say it is a bit of a downgrade from the Hail Strike, though it is more general purpose, which does give it some bonus points as this can apply to anything instead of just non-monsters or vehicles. Next, we're going to move on to buffing options, and of course this is a vehicle, so the Tech Marine can give it +1 hit and some healing, though it isn't very practical, as he cannot keep up with it in any way, and also he would generally, this thing needs to get up close with its guns, so it can't even hang back and just fire off chip shots. And itself, of course, is a very solid buffer, because it gives, of course, that ignores cover. But it's nothing too special aside from that in terms of a direct buffer. Works well as an aggressive skimmer, though. And the things that it has, the meltaguns, the missile launchers, are quite capable against things like sentinels or mega knobs being perfect targets for it. And of course its rockets are the longest range, so just use those to apply the debuff to whatever unit is necessary if you want to debuff something aside from the main target. In terms of detachment options, Gladius, he does like Advance and Shoot because it lets him move even faster. Firestorm, he, of course, again, likes the Advance and Shoot, and Extra Strength can actually be very useful with the Meltagun and missiles to make them more effective against Toughness 10 vehicles. And Vulcan, if you're running him in this detachment, though I suppose you could run him elsewhere, Vulcan can give them rerolls to wound through his sort of Oath of Moment type ability. In terms of Stormlance, I'd say it's an okay target for Ride Hard and Ride Fast. And then Ravenwing, because it of course does have the keyword for Ravenwing, it does, of course, for the third time, like to advance and shoot. Rapid Reappraisal does allow it to redeploy for relatively cheap with Deep Strike, and of course that allows you to get within range of its best guns fairly easily, just by being able to jump across the board, though its high speed does mean it's slightly redundant to be using that. It is useful to cross distances so great that even this thing could not cover them. I did also want to give a small mention to the Iron Storm Assault Force, because that, of course, gives you the 1 reroll, which could be useful to reroll a wound on the Meltagun, especially when you're wounding on 5s, against things like Land Raiders or Imperial Knights, because wounding will be the tough part there, and also where Melta tends to fail. In terms of Crusade rules, it's, of course, very similar to the Stormspeeder Hail Strike. It likes Resilient Machine Spirit from the Space Marines for 2 extra wounds, though the other 2 are mainly pointless. In terms of weapon modification, extra strength or damage are appreciated by all of the main weapons. The Tyrannic War things can give it Blessed Hull, which is of course very nice. gives it a 5+ invul. Auto repair nodes gives it healing every turn and reinforced superstructure. Gives it -1 AP against strength 7 and below, so again, very useful against things like heavy bolters, custodies, and some kinds of plasma, especially if they're not overcharged for whatever reason. In terms of Pariah Nexus, Hardened Defenses is generally useful just to give it a little bit of extra durability, giving it a 6+ Feel No Pain, and Reaper does make it a very solid Hunter of Infantry, and Tank Hunter makes it a very, well, not very, but a reasonably effective Hunter of Vehicles, as that gives it, of course, reroll 1s to wound, which, while not the most impactful when it'll be wounding on 5s, is still very useful. Next, we do have to cover the competitors, and in terms of competitors, the first thing that comes to mind would, of course, be the Gladiator Lancer, which is a dedicated anti-armor destroyer, where this is, of course, what this also attempts to do, though the Lancer, of course, is maybe not significantly tougher, but it offers much more range and much more damage output, and it will be very hard to beat that in terms of this thing's damage. And the Predator Annihilator is also in the same price bracket and is also a dedicated tank hunter, and I think it actually does its job quite well compared to this, again, if you're just going for pure damage, but again, not a direct comparison. And the Stormspeeder Hailstrike, I think, offers, in my opinion, a better buff, of course, more restricted, but it is more restricted, but in a lot of ways more impactful, and even in matchups where you may be facing Imperial Knights or Chaos Knights, they often bring in allies of things like Inquisitorial Henchmen or Nurglings in the terms of Chaos, and getting extra AP against them, well, maybe not the Nurglings, but getting extra AP against things like Imperial Agents could be very useful just to scrape them off an objective more efficiently. Though, of course, this thing could do the job just well, it's just more tailored to taking out heavier infantry instead of hordes. And its buff, of course, can apply to anything, not just non-monsters or vehicles. And then, of course, Deimos Predator can take the Magna Melta Cannon, which completely outclasses this thing in every way, and bring 2 las cannons, all for 10 points cheaper. In terms of its best use, the Hammer Strike, in my opinion, is the weakest of the 3. It is rather unfocused, ignores cover, is solid, and it is the most general. It also isn't the most impactful. Again, the Hail Strike offering a directly better rule, generally. Though I also think its guns are a bit of a letdown. While Melta is quite good, it generally needs something extra to give it a little extra punch against the toughest vehicles in the game. But it will be very adept at killing things like Space Marines, Mega Knobs, Sentinels, other land speeders, and skimmer-type vehicles like that. But again, it's sort of punching down at this point's cost. It does still offer most of what the Hail Strike does, and if you do just want to get a fast-moving skimmer, and have the points, upgrading to a Hammer Strike I think is fine if you aren't trying to use it as a buffing piece, but instead an auxiliary, say, objective unit. But I would generally say the Hail Strike is the better of the 2 of these sort of cheaper ones, just because +1 AP is just going to be more impactful in more situations. And there's also, of course, just the fact that cover is generally so easy to get. While it's nice to deny, getting +1 AP does the same thing. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Storm Speeders are flexible and used in a variety of tactical roles by the Primaris Space Marines as anti-grav skimmer vehicles that can carry quite a lot of arms and armor. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Storm Speeder Hail Strike, the light infantry slaying version of the Storm Speeders of the Primaris Space Marines. So the Stormspeeder Hail Strike comes in at a rather cheap 115 points for a relatively standard sort of skimmer profile, if not a little bulkier. It moves 14 inches, so it is very fast. Toughness 9, which is quite solid against most weapons, though again things like las cannons will give it trouble. A 3+ save is standard for Space Marines, and 11 wounds is actually quite a lot for this points cost. It's about as cheap as you can get those wounds. It has Leadership 6+, which is fine, but nothing special, and OC3 for taking objectives slightly more efficiently than something like a Rhino. In terms of ranged weapons, it has an Onslaught Gatling Cannon, which is devastating wounds with 8 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range with Strength 5, AP 0, and Damage 1. A very solid flurry of anti-light infantry shots, and the dev wounds helps it chip in a little bit against bigger things. The Frag Storm Grenade Launchers, which gets 2 of, are Blast, D6 attacks that hit on 3s at 18-inch range, with Strength 4, AP 0, and Damage 1. Again, fairly standard light infantry killer with Blast, which is very useful. Twin Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers, which are Rapid Fire 3, twin linked with 3 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range, with Strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Again, similar to the frag storms, though the extra range does help. This will probably be your main way of applying the buff at long range. In terms of melee weapons, it just has its Armored Hull, which is 4 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1, which is really bad, but this thing wouldn't want to be in melee anyways. In terms of abilities, it has Deadly Demise D3 and Deep Strike. Deep Strike is relatively handy, though it is rather big, so finding a small spot to drop it could be difficult. And Hail Strike is its core ability. After this model is shot, select one enemy unit hit by one or more of its attacks, excluding monsters or vehicles. Each time an Astartes unit attacks that enemy unit, add 1 to the AP of that attack. This is generally quite powerful. Some of the most tough things in the game can surprisingly be infantry, and so adding a way to reduce their survivability is very useful. And the Twin Hail Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers, being as long range as they are, mean it should be relatively easy to apply this to whatever target you want, presumably the Oath of Moment target. In terms of buff options for itself, which I wouldn't say is very important, the Tech Marine's +1 to hit is nice just to make it more consistent, though it has enough attacks, I would say that's not really a problem. And the healing can be nice, but again, I would say this isn't consistent because the Tech Marine is so slow, and this thing is going to want to be flying off to do other things while it shoots. And funnily enough, itself, I think, is a good buff option for everything else, because it is mainly a buffing piece, is what you're paying for all those points. So it works quite well with a lot of units, and is very useful for things like Predator Destructors to get them extra AP, or even things like Gatling cannons on a Predator Reaper. In terms of detachments, Gladius gives it Advance and Shoot, which it does like, so it can move even faster than it already does, averaging about 17 inches with Advance and Shoot. In terms of Firestorm, again, Advance and Shoot, very good. Extra Strength is also pretty useful to make it more effective at killing things like orcs. And the Stormlance can give it Ride Hard and Ride Fast, which is alright, though I would say not exactly the most outstanding points for that. I would say something like a Storm Raven would be better. In terms of the Ravenwing detachment, again, it likes to advance and shoot, and Rapid Reappraisal is actually pretty interesting, as I believe it's the only target for that has Deep Strike, excluding the other Storm Speeders, to be picked up off the board and then dropped down wherever it needs, which, while not the most useful, can be helpful in something like the bottom of turn 4, where then, of course, at turn 5, you could get this thing literally anywhere on the board with Deep Strike. In terms of Anvil Siege Force, I think it's actually a very nice buffing piece there, because it makes things like bolters, heavy bolters, and other heavy weapons more effective against big infantry things. It's just another way to go all in on a single target, presumably again the Oath of Moment, and then for everything else it works fine as a objective grabber and buffer, as it's so fast it can do most things pretty easily. In terms of Crusade rules, Space Marines can give it an extra 2 wounds through Resilient Machine Spirit, which is actually pretty nice, which would make it significantly tougher. In terms of weapon modification, I would say extra damage is going to be your best bet, though strength isn't the worst, just to get them up to something a little more competent against Marines. And AP, of course, is always useful. If you're playing Tyrannic War, Blessed Hole is nice for that 5+ invul to make it really tough. Auto repair nodes also really useful to keep it from taking chip damage over the game, which means they'd really need to dedicate some firepower to it. Reinforced superstructure is helpful against things like, again, heavy bolters, custodes, and elite crew is generally nice for extra accuracy. And Pariah Nexus doesn't have the most, but hardened defenses is again very useful for a little feel no pain. And of course, Reaper does make it very good against infantry, which it will usually be shooting at anyways to apply its buff. Though, aside from that, there's not too much in Pariah Nexus that particularly directly benefits the Storm Speeders. However, I would say that the things it can get are relatively solid. Next, we're going to move on to the competitors for this thing's role. In terms of competitors, though, the Gladiator Reaper immediately comes to mind if you are just looking for anti-infantry firepower, but it's not a direct comparison, as the Gladiator Reaper is more something that would be a sort of central unit, or even something on the flanks, but this is more of a unit you would buy for its buff and more objective grabbing. The Predator Destructor pretty much falls into the same thing. It's a bit more jack-of-all-trades, though, though it is a little closer in the price bracket, as the Gladiator Reaper is a whole, 45 points more expensive than this, which is a significant investment. I also want to give a shout out to the Deimos Predator from Legends, which is an 115 point predator that can take a lot of different weapons, and the main reason I call it out is because, again, it costs the exact same as the Storm Speeder, which means if you're just looking for a damaging vehicle that's decently fast, the Deimos Predator offers what I would consider a significantly better product. But of course, that's only if you're using Legends, presumably in something like a narrative campaign, which is something that I personally quite enjoy. I will be doing a video on the Deimos Predator, mainly because it's really interesting and I think offers some great fire support for Crusade Space Marine forces. However, that's not the point of this video. We are, of course, focusing on the Storm Speeder. I just wanted to make it more known how good the Deimos Predator, I think, actually is. Next, though, we have to move on to its best use. And the Hail Strike is really a not very complex unit. It has a decent spread of anti-infantry weapons. Of course, that's its main role, is just blowing up light infantry like Guardsmen, Eldar, Gretchen, things like that. I will say its toughness is quite solid for the cost. It is, of course, very vulnerable to things like melta-guns, but anything less than that it will be quite tough towards, and will take a decent amount of firepower to kill. It does stand out in its features with its blazing speed. In a lot of ways, it's not too dissimilar to a Distraction Carnifex with how big it is, though it's more so not as intimidating to look at, so you'll probably at least get 2 turns out of this thing giving its buffs, and also flying around the board to get to other objectives. In terms of its buff, though, things like Custodes or Meganobs will really not appreciate the extra AP, making everything from stuff like Predator Destructors or Gladiator Reapers significantly more effective. The Predator Destructor, specifically, getting all the way up to AP 3 against infantry, which certainly reminds me of 9th edition. And even outside of that, it works well enough as a fast-moving vehicle just to do objectives if you're fighting something like Knights, where it likely won't be as effective, but even then, if they have Imperial agents, it would be useful to shoot at them. Overall, it's a fine vehicle, but it's very humble, but it just does its job well, and that's fine enough. I've been Spoons Rattling, hope you enjoyed this video. The Storm Speeder Thunderstrike is the final variation of the Storm Speeder model, equipped with the heaviest weapons available to help it hunt tanks and enemy monsters. It is of course fast and heavily armored, as all the Storm Speeders are. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the final of the Storm Speeders. The Storm Speeder Thunderstrike, equipped with some of the best weapons available to this chassis, as well as one of the best rules for these chassis. The Storm Speeder Thunderstrike is the priciest, though, at 150 points, for a fairly standard, if nothing special, stat line of the Storm Speeders at movement 14 inches, toughness 9, a 3+ save, 11 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC3. For this points cost, it is not tough in the slightest, like its little brothers, though granted for its special rule, I think that's fair. In terms of ranged weapons, the Storm Fury Missile is one attack that hits on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 12, AP3, and damage d6+1, so effectively a las cannon. And the Thunderstrike Las Talon is 2 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range with strength 9, AP3, and damage d6+1, so a less powerful las cannon. The Twin Icarus Rocket Pod is anti-fly 2+, and twin linked at ballistic skill 3+, with d3 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range with strength 4, AP1, and damage 2. Good for dealing with Space Marines. The melee weapon is simply Armored Hull, which is 4 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 4, AP0, damage 1. That's a lot of 4s, and it is also very bad in melee. Not only for the cost, but just in general. This thing doesn't want to be in melee at all, if you couldn't tell. In terms of core abilities, it has Deadly Demise D3, so a small explosion to worry about. And it has Deep Strike if you wish for it to come in on the enemy flanks, though given its immense footprint, this may be slightly difficult to do. Thunderstrike is its special rule. After this model has made its attacks, select one enemy monster or vehicle hit by those attacks. Each time a friendly Astartes model makes a ranged attack against that unit, add 1 to the wound roll. This is of course catastrophically powerful for a lot of weapons against the biggest enemy target that will very quickly fold under these circumstances, though of course you pay no small price for it at this 150 point very fragile model, though even just getting 1 turn out of this could allow for a huge positive points trade of ensuring that this thing hits something that then goes on to be blown up by something significantly cheaper, whether that target be something like an Imperial Knight or a Imperial Guard, Bane Blade, or Rule Dorn. Moving on to buff options, Tech Marines can of course give +1 to hit, and healing is very good, but of course I would not say it's super consistent unless you're just keeping it hanging back, firing off its buffs. But that isn't what I would generally use, though I don't think it is awful, and I think that denying its great range and speed is doing it a great disservice. And then of course itself is a buffing option for dealing with, again, the toughest stuff in the game, so giant knights, etc. It excels with anything that has twin linked, and las cannons also really appreciate it. It can make even things like humble bolters threat to medium monsters, and plasma will be a full force anti-tank weapon. Of course, this thing's very pricey, but I'd say this buff is something that your enemy would seriously have to worry about. In terms of detachment options, there's of course Gladius, which is of course very good for the advance and shoot. Firestorm can give it extra strength, which is nice on the Las Talon. And once again, advance and shoot, very nice on something this fast. Stormlance, this gives it an okay target for ride hard and ride fast, though of course doesn't want to be in melee, so it would need some form of advance and shoot. Ravenwing, again, it likes advance and shoot, and rapid reappraisal does offer the ability for it to redeploy, though at this point's cost I wouldn't say it's quite as standout as it is on something like the Storm Speeder Hail Strike. Iron Storm, the big las cannon, of course, or the big missile, really likes the reroll, and giving tanks like Reaper +1 to wound can be extremely nasty, so I would say it's right at home in Iron Storm. And then, of course, for the rest of the detachments, it offers general useful objective grabbing abilities, and its buff can be very useful for just about any formation, supposing it at least has a decent contingent of fire support, which most Space Marine forces tend to bring along with them given their whole balanced approach to making war. Though, if you are running a mainly melee thing, whether that be in like Liberator Assault Group, it definitely loses some of its luster. In terms of Crusade rules to cover, in terms of Space Marines, of course, Resilient Machine Spirit is really the only useful thing for it, as it gives it +2 wounds, and the rest are both melee buffs. In terms of weapon modifications, buffing up the Las Talon is a very good idea, with either extra damage, and then buffing up its Sky Strike missiles with a +1 attack would also be super useful, and would make this thing significantly more damaging. In terms of Tyrannic War, Blessed Hole gives it a great extra toughness with a 5+ invuln. Auto Repair Nodes, of course, heals it every turn, and Reinforced Superstructure is super useful against things like Standard Plasma, Custodes Melee, and Heavy Bolters. Elite Crew also gives it nice extra accuracy, and in Pariah Nexus, Hardened Defenses is very useful for a vehicle like this, as it gives it that Feel No Pain, and Tank Hunter is generally useful and will help it excel against its intended targets, while also making it very effective against things like light vehicles that it will maul quite effectively with those reroll 1s, when it will be wounding most of them on 3s. Of course, we do all have to move on to the competition, because for at this point's cost you can get quite a lot, and one of those things you can get is the Gladiator Lancer. If you just need direct anti-tank, it's hard to beat the Lancer, because it offers a even bigger laser destroyer that has longer range and even more damage. And then, of course, I did also want to shout out the Predator Annihilator, because it is similar to the Lancer, though more of a discount version. Its damage isn't quite as apocalyptic, though it is cheaper this unit and offers better anti-tank damage on its own. And then if you are running something like a Crusade or a narrative campaign or game, the Legends Deimos Predator offers excellent anti-tank firepower at close range on a much cheaper chassis, clocking in at only 115 points. Of course, though, this isn't exactly the same role, it's more so just an alternative version of it, as it can't get something like a top-mounted las cannon to really go all in on long-range anti-tank firepower. Its best anti-tank weapon, of course, being the Melted Destroyer, which is very close range. That of course, is for the Deimos Predator video when we get to that. In terms of any other competitors, honestly, I think the Stormspeeder Hail Strike gives it a solid run for its money with another good buff if you're more worried about infantry. But these are definitely the two main ones in the same price bracket. I would mention things like Land Raiders or Repulsors, but they cost so much more in points that I don't think it's really even fair to compare the two in the same bracket. Moving on to the best use for this thing, I believe it is the best of the three. I think that its buff is just powerful enough that it has a place in most armies, because a lot of enemies you'll be facing will have some form of vehicle, whether that be a big transport or just a big shooty vehicle that really needs to go down quickly. And this thing gives it a very competent way of doing that through its humongous buff for whatever your army's shooting at. And some armies, like Knights, for example, will be weeping should they see this on the other side of the table, because it means that Oath of Moment, which is already extremely effective against them, will have a partner in crime with the +1 to wound, which can mean that they have to delegate a lot of firepower to destroy this thing, whether they want to risk getting something like a +1 to wound on one of their most important Knights, which would then, of course, get blown up by just about everything that focuses fire at it, thanks to the +1 to wound, which makes everything significantly more effective against them, especially the likes of las cannons and plasma guns. Anyways, that brings us to the end of our 3-part review on the Storm Speeders. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly didn't, really. These units are all so extremely similar that it became slightly mind-numbing to talk about. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.